Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline and I create crafting content here on YouTube. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you step by step how to knit your own cabled shawl. So this is definitely one of my favorite cable patterns that I've ever come out with and I'm quite excited about it. So I hope you enjoy this video and pattern as well. And basically what we're going to be working through in this tutorial is first I'm going to show you step by step how to read a knitting cable chart for flat knitting. So it's different than knitting in the round, which I do have a separate video for. I'll link that one up above if you're curious about it. But in this video, we're going to be reading a flat knitting chart. We're going to start at the one corner, cast on a few stitches, then we're going to increase all the way throughout the shawl. We're going to get to the center portion where we're just going to work straight for a bit, and then we're going to decrease down through the other side until lastly we reach the other edge and we cast off. So one of the really nice things about this yarn, this shawl, is that it's knit out of bulky weight yarn, so it is a quick knit. I hope you enjoyed this. In this video, I am going to walk you through each one of the cable stitches that you see in the pattern. That way it'll help you understand further how to work those in your actual work. And I hope you enjoy. Down in the description box below, you're going to find a few things. So first, you're going to find the full written version of the pattern. Then you're also going to find each one of the video breakpoints. That way you can fast forward or rewind to any specific part of this video that you're looking for. Now, if you are just interested in the part where I talk about how to read a flat knitting cable chart, I do have a separate video for that where I just broke out that portion of the video. So if you're curious about that one, again, I'll link that one up above. So let's get started. I'm very excited. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. I just hit 5,000 subscribers, which I'm so excited about. So thank you all so much for your support. I hope you enjoy knitting just as much as I do and crafting generally. But yeah, if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button and let's get started. The yarn for today's tutorial was kindly provided by Lion Brand Yarn, so thank you Lion Brand. This one is from their collaboration with Two of Wands, and this yarn is called Hue Plus Me. I loved this blush pink colorway, and this one is called Love Song. This base is 80% acrylic, 20% wool. It's machine washable and dryable. This one is a bulky or number 5 yarn. It recommends a size US 10.5 or 6.5 millimeter knitting needle. We're going to be going just a bit larger than that. And then on each ball of yarn, you get 137 yards or 125 meters. I'll have this yarn linked down below. To start out, this is the supplies I have in front of me. So first, I have my yarn. Next up, I have my US 11 or 8 millimeter circular knitting needle, and I'm using a fairly long cord. This is probably about 40-inch cord. I have 2 cable needles. So really I only own 1 cable needle, but for this project, you do need 2. So for my second cable needle, I'm just going to be using a double-pointed needle. I have my charts printed out. And then I also have a highlighter so that I can mark my rows on my chart. To start out, I'm going to cast on 11 stitches, and you can use really whatever cast on method you'd like for the shawl. I'm going to be using the long tail cast on because that's one of my favorite cast on methods, and I like the stretch that it has. So now that I've cast on those 11 stitches, I'm ready to begin working from the chart. So first, I'm just going to go over some things about how to read a chart when working flat, and then we're going to actually begin working through it. So here I have chart A, and this is just the bottom portion here because I'm zoomed in a bit. But the first thing you want to note whenever you look at a knitting chart is, are you knitting flat or are you knitting in the round? So I do have a separate video showing how to read a chart when you're knitting in the round. For this though, we're knitting flat. So the key when you're knitting flat is first, you're gonna read from the bottom to the top. So that's the same as in the round. But the tricky thing here is you're gonna read the lines in different directions depending on whether you're on the right side or the front side of your work or the back side, also known as the wrong side of your work. So down here at the bottom, you can see I've put in 2 little arrows. So we just cast on 11 stitches. So in our cast on row, we were essentially working from right to left. And now the first row we're going to work on the chart is going to be a wrong side row. So we're going to be working across the back of our knitting. So because we're working across the back of our knitting, we're going to be working in the opposite direction. So we're going to read this chart from left over towards right. So that's why I put this little wrong side arrow going that way. Then when we turn our work again to begin working the second row, we're going to be back on the front side of our work, also known as the right side. So in that case, we're going to be working from right to left again. So you can see I've put the arrow there. So when we alternate between the rows, we're going to alternate the directions we're working. So row 1, we're going to read from left to right. Then row 2, we're going to read from right to left. Row 3, we read from left to right. And we're going to continue alternating exactly like that. Now, different flat knitting charts will indicate these arrows differently at the bottom. So sometimes you'll see they start off with the right side row and then move to the wrong side row. So you just want to make sure that you're paying attention to whether it is the right side or the wrong side of your work, and that you're following along with the arrows that are designated in the chart that you're working with. So the next thing that's important to recognize when you're looking at a flat knitting chart is the colors of the squares. So this can be incredibly tricky on flat knitting charts. The reason it's tricky is because the colors that are on these charts represent what you would see when you're looking at just the front of your work. So the gray in here, those ones would all be purl bumps. All the gray all over the chart, those are purl bumps. So when you're looking at the front of your work, you want that all to appear as a purl bump. The white stitches are all knit stitches. So when you're looking at the front of your work or the right side of your work, you want all those to appear as knit stitches. So why is this tricky? This is tricky because when you're working across the back of your work, if you want the front side of your work to appear as a purl bump, you actually need to knit that stitch. So these gray stitches and the white stitches are going to be different depending on whether or not you're working across the right side or the wrong side of your work. So here's a little sample that I've knit of just this beginning part of the chart. So the clearest way to show it is in this larger gray portion in here. Right, so when I'm working across a row and I get to working across the right side, so this is the top side, it's facing me. When I'm working across this row and over here I want one of these to be a purl bump, all I'd simply have to do is purl that stitch. Now when I turn my work and I'm working in the opposite direction across one of these rows, and I want, again, on the front side of my work, that stitch to appear as a purl bump, how do I do that? I would actually want to knit that stitch when I'm on the wrong side of my work so that on the right side of my work, it appears as a purl bump. The same thing applies for the knit stitches. So when I'm working across the right side of my work, so I know this is the right side because I can see all my pretty cables. I'm working across the right side of my work. There, I'd want to knit those stitches because I want them to appear as knit stitches. Now when I turn my work and I'm working in the opposite direction across that row, and I get over here to where my cables are, I know on the front I want it to appear as a knit stitch. So when I'm on this side of my work, I need to purl those stitches. So that's why it can be incredibly tricky with the different colors on a flat knitting chart. So again, this is all written out on the legend portion, but when you're working across a right side row and you see a white square, that's a knit stitch. If you see a gray square, that's a purl stitch. When you're working across a wrong side row, if you see a gray square, that's a knit stitch. And if you see a white square, that's a purl stitch. So it can be tricky at first, but then as we learn to move along and continue reading our knitting, it becomes easier and easier. So those two tricks of first reading back and forth across your knitting, depending on whether or not you're on a right side or a wrong side row, and also knowing that the colors that are shown on this chart represent what you want to see on the front side of your work, are the two biggest keys to reading a knitting chart for flat knitting. And although it's a little surprising, I feel like usually we think of knitting in the round as being trickier. I actually think flat knitting charts are more difficult than knitting in the round knitting charts. So just something to keep in mind. Now the next thing I want to go through is how to read the different cable symbols that occur on our knitting chart. So the first thing I just want to point out is that all the cables are going to appear on right side or the front side of our work. So it's always going to appear on these even rows. So when I'm looking at a cable symbol, the first thing I note is that they take up more than one box. So each one of these boxes represents one stitch. So the first thing I do when I see a cable stitch is I count how many boxes it takes up. So let's say we're looking at this cable stitch in row 2. This stitch takes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches. So this cable stitch is going to involve 6 stitches total. The next thing I figure out is how many stitches do I need to hold on a cable needle, and do I need to hold that cable needle in the front or the back of my work? So to identify this, I look at the lower right-hand corner. So in this lower right-hand corner, you can see a parallelogram forming, right? So you see this line, and then it goes behind this parallelogram that's going in the other direction. So what that tells me is that these initial stitches are going to go behind stitches. So that tells me I need to hold this cable needle in the back of my work. Next, I need to figure out how many stitches to hold in the back of my work. So this initial kind of like bottom right-hand corner, this parallelogram takes up 1, 2, 3 stitches. So in this case, I take 3 stitches, put them on a cable needle, and hold them in the back of my work because this line is going behind this larger white box. Then I would knit 1, 2, 3 stitches from my left-hand needle, and then I would go back and knit those 3 stitches being held on my cable needle. Now you'll notice there that I said to knit all those stitches. So I knitted the stitches that were being held on the cable needle, and I knitted the stitches that were just being knit regularly from my left-hand needle. So how did I know how to do that? I knew how to do that by the color of my cable stitch. So this one again is worked on a right side row. So when we have a white stitch on a right side row, that means that we knit it. So you could see something in comparison, like let's say we were looking at this stitch right up here. Try and make it a little bolder so you know which one I'm looking at. Now instead, let's say we were looking at this stitch. You can see the background of this stitch is gray. So in that case, we'd be purling that stitch there. So let's try, as we just broke down this cable stitch, of take the first 3 stitches, hold them in the back of our work because this line is going behind this kind of like parallelogram going in the front of our work. So we held 3 stitches on a cable needle behind our work. We then knit the next 3 stitches from our left-hand needle, and then we knitted those 3 stitches from the cable needle. Let's try breaking down this cable stitch. So again, if I look at the bottom right-hand corner, here you can see this parallelogram is going in front of this diagonal line in the back. So what does that tell us here? So here, that tells us that we're going to take however many stitches this box takes up. So this takes up 1, 2, 3 stitches. We're going to take 3 stitches. We're going to hold them on a cable needle in front of our work. Then behind our work, or on the other knitting needle really, we just have 1 stitch going behind those stitches. So we're going to purl 1 stitch because this is a gray background. Then we're going to knit those 3 stitches from our cable needle. So there's a couple things that I just went through that I just want to really reinforce. So first, the way you figure out how many stitches and whether or not to hold the cable needle in the front or the back of your work is by looking at that bottom right-hand corner. So the bottom right-hand corner tells us how many stitches to put on our cable needle, and then it tells us whether to go in the front of our work or the back of our work. Then if we look at the bottom left-hand corner, that tells us how many stitches to work from our left-hand needle. So in the case over here, we had 3 stitches going in front, starting over here at the left side. So we knit 3 stitches from our left-hand needle. In this case over here, we had 1 stitch starting over here in the bottom left corner, or 1 box. So in that case, we just purled, because it's a gray background, that 1 stitch from that left-hand needle. So those are the 2 things that are really important when working cable stitches. And that really allows you to read your cable chart rather than looking up each stitch as you work along. Now the last stitch I want to point out on this chart A is this one right here that occurs in row 4, 14, 24, and then so on up the chart. It's the one that kind of connects this knit column to the purl stitches over here on the other side. So when we look at this cable, we see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches involved in this cable. And this cable stitch really is a little bit clearer in the PDF version of the pattern, so I'll put the picture of what it looks like here. The tricky thing about this cable is that you actually need 2 cable needles. So first, if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, again, using what we know, we count how many stitches come from the bottom right-hand corner. So this parallelogram takes up 3 stitches, and it goes in front, right? Because we can see that full parallelogram. So we would take 3 stitches, put them on our cable needle, and hold them in the front of our work. Then you can see in this center portion that there's just a gray background. So that's actually just a purl stitch that we're just keeping exactly in the same place. So we want that purl stitch to really just stay in the same location, and we're going to be switching around the 3 sets of stitches on either side. So I'm going to take that purl stitch, slide it onto my second cable needle, and hold it in the back of my work. Then if I look at the lower left-hand corner, I can see again, this parallelogram takes up 3 stitches. So I'm going to knit 3 stitches from my left-hand needle. Then I'm going to work that purl stitch being held on my cable needle. And then I'm going to knit the 3 stitches being held on my first cable needle. And that's how you create this full 7-stitch cable. And this one's particularly tricky because it does involve 2 different cable needles. So that's why I broke this one down separately. But again, the full written version of this cable will be described in the legend. So now when I work across this first wrong side row that I've highlighted in orange here, again, I'm working in the direction of the arrow. So I want to start off with this stitch number 11 and then work over towards the right. So here I'm just going to be slipping the first stitch purlwise, and you'll see that on every wrong side row we're going to be slipping the stitch. So for this first row, or the first wrong side row, I'm just going to slip this stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Then you'll see the rest of these boxes are white boxes. So that means I want them to appear as knit stitches on the front of my work. But right now I'm working across the back of my work. So therefore I'm going to purl each one of these stitches. So I'm going to purl across the rest of the row. And now I'm going to turn my work. Now I'm ready to work across row 2. So row 2 starts out with the cable stitch, and this is the one we broke down before. So if I look in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that the parallelogram starts out and it's going behind. This one takes up 1, 2, 3 stitches. So I'm going to take 3 stitches, put them on my cable needle. And again, those stitches are going behind, so I'm going to hold them in the back of my work. Now, if I look at the bottom left-hand corner here, this parallelogram takes up 1, 2, 3 stitches. So I'm going to knit 3 stitches from my left-hand knitting needle. And so when I go in to knit that first stitch, it can be a little tricky at the beginning of the round. So I'm just going to insert my right knitting needle, and then I want to take my working yarn and kind of go in front of my cable needle, wrap it around, pull through for that first stitch, and that kind of prevents any strange yarn over or yarn bumps from forming. Now I knit 3. Now I'm going to push those 3 stitches on my cable needle up to the furthest right point, and now I'm going to knit those 3 stitches. Okay, so next up it shows 4 white boxes. So that means we're going to knit 4 stitches because we're on the right side of our work. I'm going to knit 4. And now you see this M symbol, and it's an M in a gray box. So the M means we need to make 1 stitch. And it's a gray box, so that means we want to make it purlwise. So the way I'm going to work this stitch is I'm going to purl into the front and the back of this last stitch. So to do this, let me get my tail out of the way real quick. I'm going to bring my working yarn to the front. I'm going to take my right knitting needle, go into that last stitch as if to purl, just as I normally would. Wrap my yarn around, pull through. So that was just a regular purl stitch, but I left the stitch over here on my left-hand knitting needle. Now I want to take my right knitting needle and go into the back of that stitch, going from the left to the right into the base of that stitch. Wrap my yarn around again, and now push it through towards the back. So now I've purled into that stitch twice and created one stitch. So that's how we work this M. So anytime you see the M in the gray box, we're working a purl front and purl back. Now I'm on row 3, and again, row 3 is a wrong side row, so I'm working from left to right. Again, I want to slip the first stitch. So I'm going to slip this first stitch purlwise, bring my yarn to the back, and then next up I have a gray box. So a gray box, and I'm on the wrong side of my work. So I want on the front side of my work, I want this to appear as a purl bump. So on the back side of my work, I'm going to knit that stitch. So I slip one purlwise, then I knit one stitch, and now across the rest of the row we have all white boxes. But again, I'm on the back of my work, so on the front I want those to appear as knit stitches. So on the back of my work, I'm going to purl each one of those stitches. Now when I turn my work again, I'm ready to work row 4. So let me just highlight again row 3 so I know I finished it. So here on row 4, the first thing we have are 3 white boxes, and we're working a right side row. So again, we're reading from right to left. 3 white boxes, we're on the front of our work. So I'm going to knit those 3 stitches. Now we have the most complicated cable. So this was the cable I talked about before where we need 2 cable needles. So first, if I start in this lower right-hand corner, I can see that this parallelogram takes up 1, 2, 3 stitches and it goes in front. So I'm going to slide 3 stitches from my cable needle, hold them in the front of my work. Then, it's difficult to see out in this printout, but I'll put the computer version up on the screen. In the center version of this stitch, you can see that there's just a gray box. So we basically just want that 1 purl stitch in the middle to stay in the same location, and we want the 3 stitches on either side to switch. So I'm going to take my next stitch on my left-hand needle, slide it onto my next stitch holder, hold this one in the back of my work, and now I want this left-hand corner. Look at the bottom left-hand corner, 1, 2, 3 stitches. So I'm going to knit 3 stitches from my left-hand knitting needle. So again, just to summarize how I'm holding all these cable needles, 3 stitches on a cable needle being held in the front of my work. Then I have the next stitch on a cable needle being held in the back of my work. And now I'm going to go in between those 2 knitting needles, and I'm going to knit the next 3 stitches for my left-hand knitting needle. Now again, I wanted that purl stitch to stay in between, so I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, work the purl stitch from my back cable needle. So I don't need that cable needle anymore, makes it a little easier to hold. And now I want to knit those last 3 stitches that were being held in the front of my work. So I'm going to slide those stitches over to the right on the cable needle, bring my yarn to the back again because I'm knitting again, and I'm going to knit those next 3 stitches. Okay, so that's that 7-stitch cable that you see that connects the knit stitches and the purl stitches throughout this pattern. So now, next up, I have an M in a gray box. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, purl into the front and the back of this next stitch. Then I just have a gray stitch at the end, so I'm going to purl the last stitch. Now next up again, as with every wrong side row, we're going to slip the first stitch. So I'm going to slip this first stitch purlwise. Then next I have 2 gray boxes. So on the front of my work, or the right side of my work, I want those to appear as purl bumps. So on the back side of my work, I'm gonna knit those 2 stitches. Then I have 3 white boxes. So on the back of my work, I'm gonna purl those. One gray, I'm gonna knit that, and then 6 white. So I'm gonna purl those remaining stitches. So on this next row, and this will be the last cable stitch I show from chart A. So first I'm just gonna work across those initial 6 stitches. Then I have 1 gray bump on the right side of my work, so that's gonna be a purl stitch. And next up I have this cable stitch. So this one, if I look in the bottom right-hand corner, I have 1, 2, 3 stitches being held in the front of my work. Gonna slide the next 3 stitches onto a cable needle, hold in the front. Then I have 1 stitch going behind, and it's gray, so I'm gonna purl the next stitch from my left-hand knitting needle. Bring my yarn to the back again, and now knit those 3 stitches from the cable needle. Now next up, I have a make 1 purlwise. So I'm gonna purl into the front and the back of that same stitch. And now I'm gonna purl the last stitch. And now again, I'm gonna turn my work. I'm gonna slip the first stitch purlwise, and then I'm just gonna work in pattern across this row. So I would knit 2, purl 3, knit 2, purl 6. So one thing I wanted to mention real quick is why there are gaps in between some of the rows. So you'll see, for example, between row 8 and row 9, there's a thin white gap. So why did I put that there? The main reason I put it there is to help you align the stitches. So for example, if we first look at row 6 to 7, so here you can see that the square below it perfectly lines up, right? So these first 6 stitches going up this whole column are always going to be knit stitches on the outside of the work. Then over here where we have this cable, right, we're taking 2 knit stitches, moving them towards the left, 1 block, and then you can see the 3 knit stitches again. They've just shifted over 1. Well, what happens on these rows right before the little gaps is that there's 2 stitches that we create in those rows. So we create 1 stitch in the middle of a row and 1 stitch towards the end of the row. And what that does is it shifts over the center portion of the row, and it also shifts over the end. And because we're shifting over that middle portion of the row, these cable stitches aren't going to perfectly appear to line up on this chart. So they actually do line up when you're actually knitting, but on the chart, they don't appear to. But what all you want to do is just read each one of these rows as you normally would. So for example, if row 8, you just work across, you turn your work, and then on row 9, you have 2 additional stitches here. So you just work across these stitches, and each block is just associated with 1 stitch. So the reason there are little gaps is because the row before it, we increased 2 stitches, and it moves the alignment of the full row. So as you work up through chart A and through the rest of the charts as well, you want to ensure that you keep on slipping that first stitch on each wrong side row. And what that does is it creates a really nice clean edge on this side of the work. So on the one side of our work, we have the cable pattern. And then on this side over here, we want to create this really nice slip stitch edge. And how we achieve that is by slipping the first stitch on each wrong side row. So we slip it purlwise with the yarn in back. Now, if you ever forget to slip it, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with one of these. It kind of just looks like the yarn is wrapping from one side to the other, which is fine. Nothing will happen to your work. It just doesn't create quite as clean of an edge as slipping each one of the stitches. Now I've just finished chart A, so I'm going to move this one to the side, and now I'm ready to begin chart B. So the first instruction for chart B is just to work it through 1 time. So I'm going to work row 46 to 65 1 time, and then after I've worked it 1 time, I can begin working the repeat sections in the middle of each row. So you see that there's these bold black lines. So essentially, as we keep on repeating chart B over and over again, we're going to end up with one additional repeat section every time we repeat chart B. So for instance, the first time we work chart B, we're just going to work across the row as usual. Then the second time we work chart B, we're going to work basically up to this repeat bar. Then we're going to repeat in between these two bars 2 times, and then we're going to work the end of the row. So this is how this repeat section is going to work. So all the symbols in chart B is exactly the same as in chart A, because we're still increasing up through this portion. And as it keeps on getting bigger and bigger, right, we're going to keep on seeing more of these lines come out of the cable, and the cable is going to continue up the right-hand side. Also, along the way, ensure you're still slipping that stitch along the left-hand side or the first stitch on the wrong side of your work every time. And you also can make sure you're in the right place on your chart based off of whether or not you're on a wrong side or right side row. So we finished chart A working row 45, which was a wrong side row. And now row 46 begins with a right side row, and we have the little arrow over there to tell us that. So now again, I'm going to work through this one time, and then I'll come back and show you these repeats in the center. So now I've finished working chart B that first time, and now you can see through my work, I have the one cable over here on the left, then a set of 2 cables, another set of 2 cables, and then the start of 2 more over here. So what's going to happen is every time we repeat chart B, we're going to be adding in another set of these cables. So how we want to read this is first, again, we're going to go back down here to row 46. We're going to knit just as we usually would, just in pattern, working each one of these cable stitches over to this solid black line. Now in between these 2 solid black lines, we want to repeat this over and over again. And the number of times you want to repeat it depends on the number of times you've worked chart B. So for instance, this is my second time working chart B, so I want to repeat this 2 times. So I'm going to repeat these stitches around these center 2 cables, and then again around these next 2 cables. Then once I've repeated in between these 2 black lines, 2 times in this case, then I'm going to work this final portion over here. Then I'm going to keep on doing that all the way up this chart. So again, on the next row, working in the other direction, because this one's a wrong side row again, I'm going to work just regularly to the solid black line. I'm going to repeat in between the 2 solid black lines over and over again. So in this case, 2 times. And then once I've done that, I'm just going to work across the rest of the row. Now let's say I'm on my 3rd repeat. Then on my 3rd repeat, I'm going to work across, repeat this section 3 times, and then work across the end. So that's how these repeats are going to work. And a way that you can check to make sure that all your stitches are in the right place is that these sets of 2 cables should be evenly spaced. So you should have 1 cable over here, then 6 stitches, a 3-stitch cable, then 2 stitches, another 3-stitch cable, 6, 3-stitch cable, 2, 3-stitch cable, 6. And that's basically how you can make sure that all your spacing is correct all the way throughout this shawl. So as I continue repeating, I'm going to repeat this chart B a total of 4 times. And that should take me to right around 35 inches in total length. So when I measure along this cable on the side, around 35 inches is where I'm going to stop repeating chart B. So that's also important if you decided to knit this out of a different weight of yarn, you're going to want to look for around that measurement. So once I've continued repeating chart B over and over again for that length, and you want to make sure you finish after row 65, that way we can line it up with the next chart, then I'm going to come back and show you chart C. So now I'm ready to begin working on chart C. So you'll see in the main portion of chart C, there aren't actually any cable stitches. We're only working knits and purls all throughout this section. Over here at the beginning, we do still have those beginning cables along the one edge though. The next thing you'll note is that there still are the repeat bars. So again, you're just gonna, so row 66 is a right side row. So you're gonna work all the way over to the repeat bar, then repeat this over and over again for each set of your 2 cables. And then lastly, finish off the row, turn your work, slip the first stitch, work across, repeat over and over again, and then work across the other way. So those are 2 things to note when working chart C. The next thing to note is that these 2 cables at the beginning of the rows aren't the same. So you see this one down here on row 68. This is the same cable we've been working previously. And if we look down here in the right-hand corner, we're sliding 1, 2, 3 stitches onto a cable needle, holding it in the back of our work because this line goes behind. Then we're knitting 3 stitches because this is a white parallelogram right here. We're knitting those 3 stitches, and then we're knitting the 3 stitches on the cable needle. Now when we go up here to row 72, this cable is the opposite. So here, if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, we're taking the first 3 stitches and we're gonna hold them on a cable needle in the front of our work because this parallelogram goes in the front. We're gonna knit the next 3 stitches from our left-hand needle, and then we're gonna knit those 3 stitches from our cable needle. So you see that we're switching the direction of the cables. And then later on, when I next show you chart D, we're gonna continue with this switching of the cables, and you're gonna see that all the cables throughout the chart have shifted as well. So now we're all ready to begin working chart D. And chart D has some really fun cables on it. So you'll notice a few different things here, right? So now all the cables are going to be moving over towards the right-hand side. The next thing you'll notice is that instead of increases, we have these blocks that make up 2 squares or 2 stitches with the diagonal line going through. So every time you see one of these boxes, that's going to be a decrease instead. And again, you see them over here as well. The next thing you'll notice is that these larger 7-stitch cables now have the back box being grayed out. That means that we're going to be purling some of the stitches that are being held on those cable needles. So now let's go through this first row and break it down. So to start off here, we have 3 white boxes. So I'm going to knit the first 3 stitches. Then next up, we have a 7-stitch cable. So again, this one will be a little clearer on the computer screen, so I'll put it up here in the corner so you can see it. But first we have 3 stitches in this first parallelogram, and they're being held in the back of our work, right? Because this one's going behind. So I'm going to take the next 3 stitches, slide them onto my cable needle, hold it in the back of my work. Then again, I have that center purl stitch that I just want to stay in the same spot. So I'm going to slide the next stitch, hold that one in the back of my work as well. And now this last section of this makes up 3 stitches, and it's a white box. So I'm going to knit the next 3 stitches from my left-hand knitting needle. Now I need to go back and first work that purl stitch in the center. So I'm going to work the single purl stitch. Take out that cable needle. Now, because that one going through the back is all grayed out as well, I need to purl the 3 stitches being held on the other cable needle. So I'm going to purl each one of these stitches. Now next up, we're going to purl 1 stitch, and then we have another cable here. So first let me purl that one. Okay, so this next cable here, again, we can see in the bottom right-hand corner that there's a single stitch involved and it's going behind. So I'm going to take 1 stitch, put it on my cable needle, hold it in the back. Now I need to knit the next 3 stitches from my left-hand knitting needle. And now I'm going to go back, and because the one going behind was a purl stitch, it's a grayed out box, I'm going to purl the 1 stitch being held on my cable needle. And now I'm just going to continue working across this row as I typically would. And again in chart D, we have these repeat sections. So I'm going to continue working across the first set of cables, the second set of cables, and then I'm going to repeat this section over and over again until I've reached this remaining portion. And then I'm going to work along here, work this final cable. This decrease right here is a purl 2 together. So to work a purl 2 together, you just take your right knitting needle, go into the next 2 stitches on your left knitting needle as if to purl, wrap your yarn around and pull through. So we're decreasing 1 stitch there. And then I would just work the wrong side row as I typically would, just reading across the blocks. So that's how you work each one of the cable stitches along this first row here. Now the other thing to note is that this stitch right here is again that same one from cable chart C, where we take 3 stitches, hold them in the front of our work, knit 3 from the left-hand knitting needle, and then come back and knit the 3 on the cable needle. That's the same one from chart C. And again, up here, we're gonna be decreasing at the beginning of the row as well. So those are all the tips and tricks for chart D. Chart D is a lot of fun because we get to now decrease down to the smaller size. So now I'm going to continue working this one, again, repeating it over and over again, a total of 4 times. So now I'm all done knitting all the way up through chart E as well, and I'm back down to 11 stitches, which is the same number we started with. And I do have the right side, or the front side of my work facing up. So across this row, I'm going to cast off all the stitches. And I'm just going to use a simple cast off method. So to start, I'm going to knit the first stitch. Then I'm going to knit the second stitch. Now my right hand knitting needle, I'm going to take the previous stitch, so kind of like the one furthest over here towards the right, put my left knitting needle into that stitch, then I'm going to pull that stitch up, over, and off that first stitch. So to show it again, I'm going to knit the next stitch. Now I'm going to take the previous stitch, pick that one up, over, and off. And I'm just going to go all the way across these 11 stitches, doing exactly that. Okay, so now when I end up with that 1 stitch remaining on my right knitting needle, I'm just going to tug on that stitch so it becomes a larger loop. I'm going to cut my yarn, leaving about an 8 to 10 inch tail. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back through my work and I'm going to weave in all my ends. So I have this cast off edge. Then throughout my work, I have where I switched from different balls of yarn. So we can see right here, I have 1 yarn ball ending, the next one starting. So I'm just going to take a tapestry needle and weave that in going in opposite directions. Quite a few of those going throughout my work. And then I also have the cast on edge. And once I've weaved in each one of these ends, I'm going to come back and show you how to block this piece of work. Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm actually on camera right now. But what I have in front of me to start blocking is first I just have 2 beach towels because this one is a fairly large project. Then I have a bucket with just lukewarm water in it. And for my wool wash, instead of using like traditional wool wash, I typically use dish soap. So this is the Method dish soap in there, and I just have a little bit mixed in with the lukewarm water. And then lastly, I have my shawl. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the shawl and I'm just going to submerge it in the water. I want to make sure I don't spill anything here because there are a bunch of bubbles. So I'm just going to slowly submerge this. Okay, so that looks good. Now I'm just going to let this stay here for about 15 or so minutes, and then we're going to come back and roll it out in the towels. So now it's been about 15 minutes, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to the sink and drain it and then rinse it once with water. Then I'm going to bring it back in here and I'll show you how I'm going to roll it out. So here it is, and now I'm going to take my first towel here. You can see it's drooping a bit. And first I'm just going to lightly just try and arrange it somewhat flat on here and then roll it up. And then I'm just lightly squeezing on it all the way across. Now I'm going to move this towel out of the way, grab my second towel, and do the exact same thing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay this flat on the drying mats. So I'm going to center my center cable in the middle here. And then I just kind of like to create a straight line with that top cable. So that looks perfect. Now I'm going to let this one dry. I hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial today and that you're having a lot of fun creating your own shawl. So don't forget to hit that red subscribe button, that way you stay up to date on all my future videos. And if you have any comments or questions about this pattern, feel free to leave those down below. I'll see you next time.